On the 14th of July, 1999, an employee of the Occupational Safety and Health Administration was on site in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, observing the construction of a stadium roof. In the late afternoon, they were outside the stadium, watching and filming as a large piece of metal lattice was lifted into place. They were filming still as, with a deafening screech, the crane gave way and began to topple downward onto the stadium below. Construction of Miller Park began in 1996. It was a massive project, one of the largest ever to be undertaken in Wisconsin, and would go on for several years. Once complete, the stadium would be the new home of the Milwaukee Brewers baseball team, replacing the adjacent and now outdated Milwaukee County Stadium, which had been constructed in the 1950s. One of the most exciting planned features of this new stadium was the retractable roof. This would allow games to take place in any season and any weather. To put the roof in place, some very heavy machinery indeed was required. The roof would be made from more than 30 pre-assembled steel lattices, each individual one of which was larger than a commercial airliner. These pieces would be delivered to the site and then lifted into place one by a gigantic construction crane informally known as Big Blue. Big Blue was a Lamson Transilift heavy lift crawler crane. It stood around 175 meters or 567 feet tall. It was owned by its manufacturer, Lamson, and leased to Mitsubishi, who were responsible for the construction of Miller Park. Lamson also supplied a crew of qualified specialists to operate the crane, and detailed instructions for how it should be deployed by Mitsubishi. By the 14th of July 1999, the construction of Miller Park was behind schedule and over budget. The contract Mitsubishi had entered into when they took on the job specified that they would be paid less if certain deadlines were not met. No deadlines had, at this stage, yet been missed, but many workers later reported that there was palpable concern from higher-ups about avoiding any further delays. On this day, Piece 4R3 was due to be added to the roof. Crews met in the morning and discussed the planned lift. It was, everyone could feel, a windy day. The instructions provided by Lamson dictated that Big Blue should not be used in winds of over 32 kilometers or 20 miles per hour. Not only that, but when lifting a piece this heavy, a calculation was to be performed to determine whether even these wind speeds were safe. If that calculation had been performed, operators would have noted that Big Blue should not carry out this particular lift if wind speeds exceeded 18 kilometers or 11 miles per hour. That day, wind speeds of up to 42 kilometers or 26 miles per hour were observed. Operators and supervisors agreed that they would need to monitor the wind speed closely, and the morning meeting ended. For some time it seemed as though the lift would not take place, but eventually, late in the afternoon, it went ahead regardless of the wind. Piece 4R3 was lifted high into the air and rotated over the stadium. 3 workers were sent up in a man bucket or mobile platform suspended from a second, smaller crane. Once the piece was in place, they would be responsible for the skilled and somewhat dangerous task of checking its placement and securing it. At around 5:12 p.m., a gust of wind caught the large metal roof piece. It swayed in the wind and then began pulling Big Blue out of alignment. A component at the base of the crane failed due to the immense forces acting on it, and the entire crane collapsed. It took 14 seconds to fall, and on its way down, debris hit the other crane from which the 3 workers were suspended, and sent them tumbling to their deaths on the ground below. The 3 workers who lost their lives were 40-year-old Jeffrey Wisher, 39-year-old William DeGrave, and 52-year-old Jerome Starr. 5 others were injured in the collapse. Big Blue and 1 other crane were completely destroyed, and significant damage was done to the partially constructed stadium. In the aftermath of the accident, an investigation was launched. It was very quickly found that many people working on the construction of Miller Park had significant reservations about the work they were undertaking, but few had spoken up about these concerns. Indeed, one of the men who had been killed in the accident, Jeffrey Wisher, had been so worried about working conditions on the site that he had preemptively selected an attorney for his wife to contact should he be killed or injured on the job. He had complained frequently to her about working conditions, and specifically about the attitude Mitsubishi supervisors had towards safety. But he had not felt able to formally raise these concerns at work. There was, perhaps, a good reason why he had not felt comfortable to do so. One worker who had raised these issues repeatedly was Milo Bengtsson. He had been a Lampson employee and had repeatedly complained to Mitsubishi supervisors about the way in which they were using Big Blue. He had insisted that some lifts be delayed or rearranged due to wind speeds, and had been openly critical about Mitsubishi supervisors. He had highlighted issues with unsafe working conditions and with unusual working hours. A month before the collapse, Milo Bengtsson had been fired from his job at Mitsubishi's insistence, following complaints that he was slowing down the project. His removal may have caused other workers who were uncertain about safety issues to make the difficult decision to keep those uncertainties to themselves, rather than risk losing their jobs. During the investigation, however, employees could speak freely. Workers reported that safety harnesses were not always supplied when they should have been. Lifts were often done despite less than ideal conditions, and unnecessary risks were frequently taken on the Miller Park site in order to hurry along the behind-schedule project. One such risk had been taken on the day of the accident. The lift attempted that day could have been done in 2 parts, with a smaller load each time. Lifting one component into place at a time would have taken longer, but would also have been much safer. However, for expediency, this had not been done. Something else that had not been done was the calculation concerning weight and wind speed. It should have been performed before the lift on the 14th of July, and if it had been, the lift would have been deferred to another day. Lampson insisted that Mitsubishi was responsible for carrying out and acting upon this calculation. Mitsubishi claimed that it was Lampson's responsibility. While no criminal charges were brought against anyone involved, a 7-week civil trial sought to determine who was ultimately responsible for the accident. The Mitsubishi supervisor who had finally authorized the lift, Victor Grotlich, testified that he had believed the wind speeds to be lower than they were. There was a computer system on site that monitored and reported on wind speeds, but it had no records from the day of the lift, as it had been unplugged shortly after the accident. Some workers accused Victor Grotlich of ordering it to be unplugged in order to deliberately erase this data. This, however, could not be proven. Mitsubishi argued that a bronze spacer about 1 centimetre or 1/2 inch thick, installed on Big Blue at the insistence of a Lampson employee, was the cause of the collapse. However, such spacers were often used on Lampson cranes, and were a normal part of their operation. A jury eventually found Mitsubishi to be mostly responsible for the accident, assigning them 97% of the blame, while the remaining 3% was assigned to Lampson. As a result of this, Mitsubishi was ordered to pay $99 million in punitive damages, the vast majority of which would go to the widows of the 3 men who had been killed. It was the highest amount that had ever been awarded in a workplace-related case in the history of Wisconsin. Mitsubishi and Lampson were also fined $500,000 by the Occupational Safety and Health Administration for a range of safety violations. Because of a contract dispute between Lampson and Mitsubishi, the vast majority of this amount would end up being paid by Mitsubishi. The accident, caught on film by an Occupational Safety and Health Administration employee, is now used as a case study by that organization. It underlines the importance of enabling employees to speak up when an unsafe working environment is suspected. and clarifies who is ultimately responsible for safety when one company subcontracts another. The collapsing crane caused a huge amount of damage to the unfinished stadium. Eventually, construction resumed, and the project was completed. The collapse of Big Blue during its construction added approximately $100 million to the final price tag, and extended the already lengthy construction process by a year. The stadium remains in use today, though it is now known as American Family Field. In the grounds of the stadium stands a bronze statue, honouring the memory of the 3 workers whose lives were unnecessarily lost during its construction.